Greetings and welcome to In-Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. Now, we spoke with founder of the Network and Outreach for Disability Education and Sensitization, Dr. Jean Antoine-Dunne, about an upcoming conference, and she mentioned that Senator Paul Richards was moderating a panel. So we reached out to the goodly senator, and he joins us now to give a sneak peek into the panel, as well as issues around his vocal advocacy for education and persons with different abilities. Welcome, Senator. Thank you so much for joining us. How you do?
Good day, Dike. Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
The pleasure is ours. And even before we get into a brief overview of the panel, I want to ask about your thoughts on the significance of the pandemic helping to the drive to destigmatize seeking wellness, especially mental health.
Well, I think we all were exposed to unprecedented stresses during the pandemic. I mean, there are many people who were going through significant stresses, economic and otherwise, before the pandemic. But collectively, Trinidad, Tobago, the Caribbean, the world, in this lifetime, we had not been exposed to a pandemic and the effects of the pandemic in terms of shutting down the world and what it exposed people in different age groups to had different effects on them. So younger people had their own effects, middle-aged people had their own effects, working people had the effects, the elderly had the effects, those with comorbidities, the rising death toll, even though you may not have gotten ill yourself, hearing about it on a consistent basis in the news, having to deal with it, the lockdowns, some people were furloughed. It had a significant effect on all of our physical and mental health. So I thought the conversation about wellness and mental health came to the fore, even though many may not have been physically and physically affected in terms of contracting COVID-19 or any of its variants. So I think people started to take more cognizance of their own mental health and wellness as different concepts, because mental health is one thing, wellness is a little further. Wellness to me is a little more proactive and not waiting for the pathology to set in to deal with it after it's already set in. So it's a great conversation that started in Trinidad and Tobago. I don't know if it continues as fervently as it should, but certainly people were able to do some self-assessment. Am I coping? Am I lashing out? Am I feel like I'm going under? There are a lot of dimensions to people's responses to it. And I think the conversation needs to continue, but more than that, I think people need to start seeking mental health interventions and being proactive about their general well-being and wellness.
I like the fact that you make that distinction between thinking about it more and being in consciousness at the forefront, even though it may not be acted on. But one of the things that is happening is this conference on the 21st, and you're moderating a panel. So give us a little idea about what the panel is and who may be involved in it. Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to be asked by Dr. Jean Antoine to be part of NODES, which is a Network and Outreach for Disability Education and Sensitization. It's happening the 21st of April at UAE St. Augustine campus from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. And I think it's the second or third time I'm having the honor of moderating the session through the day. Specifically, I'm going to be part of a panel, moderating a panel, which is focusing on the importance of legislation, disability-specific legislation in Trinidad and Tobago to deal with the support systems and the redress issues related to persons with disability in terms of education, employment, accessibility. Some countries have gone even far as voting access with the disability legislation. And I think while we have a great act called the Equal Opportunities Act that does some work in terms of giving people an avenue for redress if they feel that their disability makes them the subject of discrimination in any way, I think like many of the countries in the world that have gone the way of having disability-specific legislation, I know to her credit, the Minister of Social Development and Family Services has a draft which is out at some level for consultation. I think she intends to expand that consultation and input into that. We are behind the curve Guyana has a Disability Act 2010. Cayman Islands, Bahamas, Jamaica, Barbados all have disability-specific legislation. So the panel will deal with that and the importance of bringing that to book in Trinidad and Tobago.
But that the thrust to have legislation and policy entrenched and enshrined, how much does that look at the fact that it is very possible that society more than circumstances of birth disable individuals?
Well, like many other issues in the country, if you look at around the world, it's related to persons who are differently able, persons who have special needs. Look at the US, for example, it's a rights issue. Just like when Blacks were discriminated against, just like when women were discriminated against, and laws were passed to ensure that their rights were maintained in society. It's the same thing with this disability community. Very often, persons who are differently able, who have special needs, are discriminated against for educational requirements, the education that's specific to their needs. It's not an education that everybody has because they have specific, what we call special needs. And persons who may want to apply for a job because they're in a wheelchair. There's a famous case in Trinidad and Tobago where a wheelchair-bound man, very famous, took the Hall of Justice. The courts are trying to get a court because his access to justice was being denied because he couldn't access the Hall of Justice, and he won. So it was precedent-setting, but still, he had to take, in the absence of legislation that prevented such discrimination, which wasn't overt, but was because the infrastructure wasn't in place. We needed to protect persons' right to an appropriate education, cost borne by the state, diagnosis of special needs, employment opportunities, access to buildings, private and public sector buildings. And as I said before, some countries have even gone as far as making sure there are assistive technologies available for persons to vote. Their right is enshrined in the Constitution. So, that's the importance of having disability-specific legislation, so that that group that has been marginalized, that group that has been disenfranchised in many different ways, for issues related to their well-being and how they participate in society, is not on the books. So they don't have those protections in a formal sense, in a specific sense.
And it seems as though some people latch on to something, they ride a wave because it's what's trending at this point in time. But you're speaking about this. You have addressed it in an academic fashion. You also have been at the forefront of moving legislation forward. Where does that passion come from? Do you have skin in the game, or where did that originate?
Yeah, we all have skin in the game, whether we realize it or not. If we are blessed to live long enough, we will all have some sort of disability as we get older. We may have sight problems, we may have hearing problems, we may have mobility problems, we may have cognitive deficit problems. So while we may be typically presenting with able-bodied now, it will affect us, but that shouldn't be the emphasis because we're affected. We need to understand that every citizen should have the same rights, the same access, the same support or support that helps them to reach their full potential, which may be different for you, for me, for somebody who has sight impairments or hearing impairments. So it's really about understanding that every citizen should have the right to full participation in society and all that society has to offer. I mean, I started my academic journey, had no idea that I wanted to do this, did an undergrad in behavioral sciences, and had the immense blessing. I have to say it's a blessing because I didn't have this plan to meet some professors at Andrews, which is where I got my education. Dr. Bailey, Dr. Montague, and Dr. Gabriel, who introduced me to special ed. And then I think it is an act of God that, I was honored to be chosen, asked to be a part of the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago. And I was able to use my training to advocate for persons with disabilities and persons with special needs. So I think it's all a universal, not coincidence, providence. Let me use that word, that I was trained in that way, and I have the ability to use Parliament in some instances to advocate for persons with disabilities because they're a group that needs somebody advocating or people advocating strongly for them, for their rights. And I think that grew over the years because I was able to work with Down syndrome family network. I was able to work with Dr. Radhika Mays and support Autism TT, Autism Place, Mrs. Sienna Ryan in East Trinidad, Kids and Family Network in St. James, and all of these groups doing such amazing work to support persons with disabilities, persons with special needs and their families. So you get a sense of these struggles, and it has been extremely rewarding so far, and I will continue.
And on that note, we take a short break. Stay with us. We're speaking with Senator Paul Richards. We are looking at education, persons with different abilities, and an upcoming conference that is on the 21st of April. Stay with us. We return with more. Welcome back. We're very happy to be speaking with Senator Paul Richards. And you just spoke about the different groups, Senator, who are advocating, who are doing work, boots on the ground, and trying to change perceptions as well as policy. How important is it that there will be students presenting at that conference? Because I know that Dr. Jacqueline Huggins, she is the NODE's chairperson. Yes, it's one thing for you to be there, but at the same time, UWI students who are getting their feet wet, what's the significance of that to you?
Well, what is the point of us spending money and investing in educating young people if they don't become involved in the issues, in becoming involved in crafting solutions, becoming involved in advocacy? Because at the end of the day, we all have to live in this space, or some of us may migrate, and we want a better space for those who are coming after us. So I think having students involved and actively involved, and not only students, persons who are differently able, because we don't want to be typically presenting people and making decisions for persons with disabilities without their involvement. Actually, they are the ones who should be making the primary level of decisions about what works for them, what hasn't worked for them, and how we can change the system to benefit their participation in the wider society in a fulsome, holistic way. I think having the students involved creates the awareness for the next generation that past generations may not have had. So they're intimately involved. So they have a lot that we take for granted as typically presenting people, and our subconscious discriminations, not planned, but because we've been socialized in a particular way, will be less likely when you have younger people involved and socialized and understanding what persons with disabilities go through on a daily basis and how they can be a part of the solution moving forward.
And looking at those solutions moving forward, looking at eliminating blind spots, what are some of the things that we don't necessarily take into consideration? And I want to ask you specifically about parents, individuals in immediate circles with someone who has a different ability.
For example, someone has a mother who has sighted parents, and they have to take her in every, however often it is, to verify that she's alive to continue getting pension, when it's a difficult process, when that should be able to be done online to facilitate her mobility issues. You have a child who has been diagnosed, who has learning disabilities, and that child has not been diagnosed effectively, or the system isn't effectively remediating that child's learning deficit or learning issue. So the diagnosis is not there. The parent has to go to a private person to do the diagnosis, which is extremely costly. Then you have to get the therapist involved, which is also extremely costly. And while the Ministry of Education, through the Student Support Services, does provide some intervention and diagnosis, the need is so overwhelming that there's so many that are left behind the wayside. We just saw the news report about 2,500 to 3,000 dropping out of school. Ask yourself why. In many cases, it's undiagnosed learning disabilities. So that person's potential is not realized. And unfortunately, in some cases, that person becomes more vulnerable to criminal activity or gangs pulling them up. So on a daily basis, we are faced by issues in society that we don't make the connection that if we don't support persons with disabilities, persons with learning disabilities, and persons who could be significant contributors to Trinidad and Tobago's development, because they're not supported in a specific way, we are not doing ourselves any good in terms of our overall development and using what we have, which is the human capital, fully utilized by everyone who maybe have a disability, but is not less intelligent, and who can learn and who can contribute to society in a meaningful way.
Building that ecosystem of support out, how do we treat with the person who has to take time from their job to carry this family member, to show that they're alive, to have this referral done so they go to the specialist and they need to take time from work as well? What are some of those things that we can do to ameliorate, address the situation a little differently that we're possibly not doing yet?
Pass disability-specific law that ensures that the right to access to persons with disabilities, whether it be mobility issues, sight issues, hearing issues, are catered for by public sector and private sector service providers, goods and service providers. So it becomes law that if you are a service provider, for instance, a state sector service provider, that you have ramps for wheelchairs, that you have auditory prompts for persons with sight issues, that you have braille, that you have assistive technology devices for persons who have issues, that school children who need support and accommodations are given accommodations, not by somebody deciding, well, okay, I'll do it today, but by law. In very many ways, the law is what will protect persons' rights. And it will take a while. The law is not going to be an automatic pass here. There'll be a transition period where the society has to become more aware with what is required in a holistic sense. And there's a transition period required like any other paradigm moving forward. But eventually the law will mandate that the support systems and accommodations are there for persons with disabilities in transit. Because I think the law is fundamental to maintaining those rights in any particular society.
And in that transition period, does that also mean going back into addressing some of the things that are on the books? Because Dr. Antoine-Dunne was talking about something on the law, talking about not being able to bring individuals who are imbeciles into Trinidad and Tobago. And that is something that is still on the books, regardless of how much attention you pay to it. So
yeah, and laws that clauses in laws that states that a person can't participate in external because of a mental deficit, when you have no benchmark for whether the mental deficit precludes the person from performing the duty admirably, and using words like imbecile and what's the other one they use, and dumb and duncy and stupid, when persons, well, they're just insensitive words that are being used to describe human beings when it may have been appropriate 20 years ago. It's inappropriate now. And those laws, the good thing about when you change laws, there's a process called consequential amendments to laws, old laws that will have to be dealt with when the new law kicks in, that may offend, where these old laws may offend the remits, the parameters in the new laws. So I think that there's always a process of going through the law books to see what laws, the new laws, old laws, the new laws may offend, and making those consequential amendments. So that may be something that may come off the books, because then what is the scientific description of an imbecile now? And who's making that determination that that person is an imbecile and cannot get access to come into the country? Is it a customs officer, an immigration officer, sorry? Is that officer qualified to make that determination? And on what basis is he or she making a determination to deny that person entry? Just by how they look? Is that scientific? Is that how we want to go? I think not.
In the final minute and a half, some of these things that you're talking about, they require incremental steps. So they won't be happening tomorrow. But coming out of the panel, what do you hope to see some of the sensibilities being just from people having attended that panel on the 21st of April?
Public awareness, very, very important, because I mean, I had the blessing of being trained. Well, I don't take for granted what I know because of my training, that we need to start to bring the wider population on board. And it's not just about them in quotations, it's about all of us. It's about understanding that there's somebody in your family, may not be in your immediate family, but in your extended family who has a disability, who is facing challenges, and understanding that we need to be all committed to an equitable society. Here, every creed and race finds an equal place. Is that actually happening in practice? No, it's not. But we have to take steps toward making that a reality in Trinidad and Tobago. And this is one of the ways I think we can do that.
With that, we want to thank you so much for the work that you are doing and will continue to do. And on behalf
so
of
much.
the entire, our definite pleasure reminding you that the Network and Outreach for Disability Education and Sensitization knows there's a conference on the 21st of April at the UWI campus, well, the St. Augustine campus from 9 to 4. And please make every effort to attend. On behalf of the entire TTT News team, I'm Dike Rostant. This has been In Depth with me. Thank you so much for joining us.